I think, on my phone, and my name is Bob Kolodinsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Gilman Center for Free Enterprise and Ethical Leadership and a Management Professor, and I am honored and very glad to have Pietra Rivoli with us today from Georgetown University. And we just had a really wonderful lunch discussion. It was a very informal discussion that meandered through the book a bit and all sorts of topics of interest. I think you're in for a huge treat today. First, I'll say I just finished a book, and now I went to Pietra's book, and I'm loving it, in part because I'm a micro guy and not a macro person, and Pietra helps weave a story, and it truly is a series of stories that is weaved with, integrated with, the history of the cotton industry and other industries, and including apparel and textiles and the used clothing industry. And I think you would love it if you could take the time to read the book. So, summer project for you. It's fascinating. Recently, NPR did a piece, and if we have time, we'll show a short video from that longer piece, but a short part of it that I think will capture your interest as well. Just a little background on Pietra. She is a University of Florida Gator. She did her undergraduate at University of Florida and then went into a PhD program in finance and international economics. She's been at Georgetown University for 30 years and teaches international business, or her focus is international business, but she's got a pretty multifaceted background and interests. She's had the opportunity to teach experiential learning in China. She's done semesters abroad, semester at sea a couple times. She's done an abroad in Ireland, where the sun never came out for 3.5 months. She's been a deputy dean, which is like our associate dean of academics at Georgetown, and her book was a long project, a 6-year project, a labor of love that I think you'll really find fascinating. So without further ado, please welcome Pietra Rivoli to JMU.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to all of you for coming. I know that some of you all are from International Accounting class. Where's everybody else from?
Just yell it out.
Yell it out. Which class?
Or maybe
you're all International Accounting folks. No? Yeah.
International business.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. All right. So most of you, who's a business student? I guess maybe that's it.
Oh, they're all.
Okay, everybody. All right, that's great. That's great. So, so what I was going to do is talk today about the book that Bob mentioned and why I wrote it, the broad outlines of the story, why the story turned out the way it did, and then also to talk a little bit about how the book relates to some current themes that are going on out there in the global economy. So the title of the book, you can see up here on the screen, is The Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy. Okay. So what is this book about? I think the best way to understand it is that the book is a biography. So it is a life story. Only instead of being a life story of a particular person, it's a life story of a particular thing. Okay? And the life story of a particular thing allows me to look at this product, in this case a T-shirt, as kind of a lens or a way to learn about international business, the global economy, and all kinds of other issues that sort of touch on the life of this T-shirt. So, an analogy that I sometimes use is like if you read a biography, for example, of Abraham Lincoln, then you can't help but learn a lot about the history of the United States at that time, the Civil War, so forth and so on, if you really understand kind of how his life developed and evolved. And so the idea with this book is if you look at the life story of this product, this T-shirt, you will be able to understand the broader context, topics related to international trade, international economics, international business. These are all topics that the life of this T-shirt is embedded in. So really the biography is a way to learn about and to think about these broader topics. So most of you, if you've taken courses in international economics or international business and so forth, you have different ways of learning about this topic. Maybe you read the textbook, maybe you do cases, maybe you do homework and so forth. And so that's one way to learn, right? But there is another way, an additional way, and that is through this mechanism of I think of as storytelling. And that's where the biography of this product comes in. So essentially, it's a vehicle to learn about, a simple vehicle. A T-shirt is a very simple thing. A simple vehicle to try to illuminate very complex topics. So my motivating question is, the reason I wrote the book was simply to say, okay, what can the life story of this simple product teach us about how the global economy works? That was kind of the motivation in a nutshell. Now, one of the first questions that I usually get about this book is, why a T-shirt? Why not an iPhone or a lollipop or an automobile or some other product? The answer to that is kind of interesting because the reason I chose a T-shirt was that this choice was very much kind of the result of some things that were going on at my university at Georgetown at the time that I got interested in this topic. So I've been at a university, as Bob said, a long time, 30 years at Georgetown, and then before that, about 8 years at University of Florida. And one of the things that's interesting about being, in a university setting that long is that, there are kind of waves of topics that students become interested in. Okay? And oftentimes, the wave of student interest is actually a predictor of broader interest in the population later on. Okay? So, for example, in the 1960s, you saw a huge amount of student interest and activism around the topic of the Vietnamese War. Right? And about 6 to 7 years later, I would say, interest in this topic kind of peaked in the broader population, right? So it's sort of like the students kind of led not just the protests, but the overall interest in this big thing that was going on out there. When I came to Georgetown, the students were just starting to be very interested in, there's a lot of activism on the topic of apartheid in South Africa. And, and again, a few years later, U.S. Congress became interested. The U.S. put sanctions on South Africa, so forth and so on. So again, you kind of find universities as a leading edge of things that other people start to worry about a little bit later. It happened also with tobacco. Universities were among the first places to go smoke-free and so forth. So this is just kind of as backdrop. You can show the first one. About a dozen years ago, there was another topic that was attracting a lot of attention on college campuses, Georgetown included. It came to be known as the anti-globalization movement. Okay? And maybe you remember some of this. It actually rippled on in a lot of different kind of incarnations for a number of years. Most recently, anybody remember Occupy? So Occupy was, was kind of a later ripple effect of this earlier anti-globalization movement. Essentially, the theme behind this discontent had to do with fairness, really, and justice in how the global economy worked. Okay? You heard that theme in Occupy, with everybody talking about the 1%. But back here, and this is in about 1999, is people are saying, okay, wait a minute, this whole open economy, global trade thing has got problems. We think that there are injustices inherent in how business is being done in the global economy, and we don't like it. Now, on college campuses in particular, they were taking a bite out of this topic, right? And the bite was, rather than focusing on this huge thing, globalization and all trade, they focused on a bite of it. And the bite they focused on was the sweatshop issue. Okay? And by the sweatshop issue, I mean the concern that people had about how we as Western consumers, okay, are related to, through our demand in the marketplace, are related to either unfair or poor working conditions in countries, particularly in Asia. And so what we had at the time is a lot of student concern about, especially because, like I saw somewhere, there it is. What's your name? Yep, you. Yeah.
Gina?
Gina. Stand up, Gina. Gina has on, turn around a little bit. No, other way. I want to see the front. Okay. Gina has on what we call logoed apparel, right? It has the name of a university right across it, right? And so students were saying, wait a minute, if our apparel has the name of our university across it, we want to make sure that it's produced, under conditions that, we understand that we can be, okay with. And so the protests at these universities were really around this logo apparel. So somebody would ask, they would go up to Gina and they would say, do you know where that sweatshirt was made? Do you, by chance?
Do I?
Yeah.
No, I bought it at the bookstore.
At the bookstore, okay. But somewhere, what's your name?
Danielle?
Danielle, can you look in the back of Gina's, tell us where it was made?
Made in Pakistan.
Pakistan, okay. So, what the students say, hey, we're worried about that. Pakistan has a history of labor rights abuses. It has a history of very poor working conditions, unsafe factories, and we don't like that. Okay? And so we want to do something about it. We don't want to be associated as our university with these kinds of abuses. And so I got kind of pulled into this, and I said, well, wait a minute. How do you guys know that, what's going on in Pakistan was bad? And of course, that was the whole issue, is we really didn't know. It was so far away, there was really no way to kind of get our brain around. All I know is what Danielle just told me. It's Pakistan. I don't really know anything else. And so what I was motivated to do was to say, okay, since we're kind of just making stuff up here, why don't I try to investigate, an actual T-shirt and see if I can trace the life story and figure out, not just the labor conditions under which it was sewn together, but, all kinds of things about where it came from. And so that's why a T-shirt, because the students at that time were particularly interested in this topic of apparel. So this is the T-shirt that I wrote the book about. Okay? And there's no reason, I don't have a good reason for telling you that, I picked this T-shirt for a certain reason. It's not even a logo T-shirt. I was just on vacation with my kids in Florida one day, and there was a big bin of T-shirts in a Walgreens, and I just thought, I got to start this book sometime, because I've been thinking about it for a long time, and so I just reached in this bin, and I pulled out this T-shirt for $6. And I said, okay, I'm going to write a book about you. Okay? And so that's what I did, and that's what the book is about. So I can tell you, just like a biography of Abraham Lincoln would contain like certain critical things, like born here, moved here then, and so forth. I can tell you kind of the basic facts of this T-shirt's life before we go any further. That's on the next slide. All right, so this is the basic, kind of broad level story of the life story of this particular T-shirt. And what I had to do was I did what Danielle just did. I started by looking at the tag. and the tag had the name of a company, and so I called up the company, and the company told me, where they had, the company was the company that had printed it, this picture on it, and they told me where they had bought the shirt, and then I kind of kept going, investigator style back through this chain. And what I learned is that the story goes like this. So the most important cotton-producing region in the world is in West Texas. Okay? So what I learned, I guess maybe it's easier to talk about it another. Let me go take it from the other end. What I learned, first of all, was that the T-shirt came from China, okay, from a factory near Shanghai. Okay? And the T-shirt was sewn together there, but the fabric and the yarn for the T-shirt was also produced in China, although at different companies. I bought the shirt in Florida. Okay? So the T-shirt, once it was produced in Florida, or in China, went all the way back to Florida. But actually, before it got to China, it was grown in Texas. Okay? So the steps, if you will, of the supply chain were that the cotton was grown in Texas, it was shipped in bales to China. In China, it was turned into yarn and then fabric and then a T-shirt, and then it went all the way back to the United States. One of the interesting things about the story, though, that you can't quite see on this map, is that this second trip across the ocean here is a really interesting one, because the global rules that govern trade in apparel are very, very complicated. So a big part of the book was kind of, okay, how exactly do the world trade rules work to bring this T-shirt or to allow this T-shirt to come back? So that is also a big part of the book. Now, there's another piece to this, and that's in Africa. And this was a really interesting part of my research, because I started to, I went to Texas and I kind of figured out the cotton piece, which was very interesting. I went to China and I figured out the textile and the apparel piece, also really interesting. And then I became familiar with, somehow, the used clothing market. Okay? And this is really, really interesting. So I'm sure all of you, at some point, either you or your parents, every couple of years, like, you make a big pile of clothes to give away, right? To like Goodwill or something, right? You take those clothes to Goodwill, and then, like, okay, well, what happens to them? I remember what I thought. I thought, well, don't they like give them to people who need them or sell them in the stores? I thought that's what happened to those clothes. Okay. Well, it turns out that of all the clothing we throw away, only 10% stays in the United States. Okay. So if you look at all the stuff that's getting dumped into a Goodwill box, 10% of that will stay in the United States. Okay. 90% is exported. Sometimes about 60% of that 90% is exported as clothing. So we will send, 1,000-pound bales of T-shirts to Mozambique, for example. Okay. Another 30 or so percent of that 90% is cut up into rags, and rags are used in factories. Okay. And then the remainder is actually shredded and used as padding. You're probably sitting on used clothing right now in this furniture. So it's used to pad chairs and pillows and stuff like that. Okay. The biggest export of the United States to the country of Tanzania on the east coast of Africa is used clothing. So think about that. We sell more used clothing to Tanzania than we sell anything else in the world. Okay. So that is it. That's the life story of my T-shirt. Now, what I did is, I wanted to tell this whole story, but I didn't want to actually give my T-shirt away. So what I did is I went to New York, where one of the biggest used clothing processors is based. Okay, and I hung out with them for a couple days, and talked to them. I said, okay, if I were to kind of throw this in this bin, what would happen to it? And the way this business works is they sort things. They sort things into different categories, and warm clothes get sent to places like Ukraine, and light T-shirts like this get sent to Africa. So I said to them, where would this go? And they said, well, that would probably go to East Africa. So I said, okay, and I went to Tanzania to try to investigate that final part of the so-called supply chain. So that's the basic story. That's kind of where everything happened in the T-shirt's life. Any questions or comments about that before I go on? Anything about that surprise you yet?
I just have one comment. I always did wonder what happened to all those clothes at Goodwill.
Yeah.
Because there was no possible way they would all be. So I think this is fascinating.
So they're sold by the pound, actually.
Okay,
So like this
okay.
company in New York would come and they would buy them by the pound. So it's all like just a giant pile of everything. And then the company in New York would do the sorting, and the baling and the shipping. Yeah.
The printing on your T-shirt?
Yes, was done in Miami.
Miami.
In Miami, yeah. The printing is Miami. So the company in Florida imported the blank white T-shirt from China and then printed on it. This is a company that specializes in tourist designs. You know how like if you go anywhere, Yellowstone, or wherever you go, like you can buy a tourist-style T-shirt. The company that printed this is a company that specialized in that. Okay, so one of the things that used to surprise me, it doesn't anymore because it's happened so often, is the negative reactions that I sometimes get when people look at this map. Okay? Because it really is a picture of kind of globalization and global trade at work. And so if you are somebody who has concerns about globalization and international trade, maybe you don't like this picture. Maybe you look at this picture and you think, it's kind of a sad picture, right? And one of the things that's interesting is, without even knowing more than what's up on this slide, some people see, a kind of sad or threatening story in this picture. Other people see a very happy story. So it's almost like going into the psychiatrist, where they show you a picture and they say, well, what do you think about this picture? And some people think it's a happy thing and some people think it's a sad thing. What's your name?
John.
John. John, it looked like you maybe thinks this is sort of a sad picture.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily?
No.
Okay.
Do I look sad?
You looked momentarily sad.
I think I was just in deep thought about the picture.
Okay. Does anybody have a negative reaction to this picture? Does anybody look at this and say, oh, I'm kind of worried about that? Or maybe there's something to worry about here?
A little bit, maybe loss of jobs in the United States.
That's the main thing, I think, that people sometimes worry about is, wait a minute, if this T-shirt is, being the yarn and the fabric and the sewing, if that's all going in China, doesn't that mean that jobs have been lost in the United States? And so there is something going on in this picture that suggests destruction, of U.S. livelihoods, at least in some industries. That's exactly right. Okay. But then on the happy side, people would say, well, wait a minute, yeah, there's something that, there's destruction here, but there's also creation, right? There's also creation because these global trade flows are also creating jobs. Jobs are being created in China where they are needed just as like they're needed here. And so people, especially economists who tend to have a very free trade orientation, say, okay, this is just comparative advantage at work. Okay? This is making sure that things are kind of produced in countries that have the comparative advantage to produce them, and that's going to leave everybody the best off. Okay? But again, just the idea, I want to put out there, is that people do have reservations, and we see this every time there's an election, and you hear people talking about, oh, so-and-so's shipping jobs overseas, right? So it's an issue that is kind of, up front in our consciousness. The next question that we could ask is, why does the picture look exactly like this? Right? You know, why did the various phases of my T-shirt's life take place in these particular places? Okay? And, you know, if you're studying international business, then that's one of the central topics that you're always talking about, you know. If you're talking about a company, you're asking, well, you know, what should we do in this country? What should we do in that country? Where should different activities be located or placed? So we can ask this question about my T-shirt. Why exactly does it look like this? Okay. I think to address that, let's look at the supply chain in a little bit more of a linear way with the next slide. One of the things that I had to get used to, okay, was the idea that global supply chains don't start at the beginning. They start at the end. Okay? What do I mean by that? Okay. Well, if somebody had asked me before I started doing all this research, you know, well, how does the supply chain work? I would have said, oh, well, you start with the cotton on this farm, and then the cotton goes to the textile mill, which spins it into yarn, and then the textile mill sends it to the fabric producer where the yarn is knitted into fabric, and then the fabric gets sent to the firm that does the sewing, and then it gets put in the store. Because that's kind of the chronological story, and finally it goes to the consumer, right? But that's actually exactly backwards, okay? That's not how T-shirts are made. Nobody goes out and buys a bale of cotton and says, I think I'll make a T-shirt. Okay? It doesn't work that way. It always starts with somebody's judgment about what a consumer wants. Okay? Always. So if you are Gap, okay, you are sitting in Gap headquarters and you're thinking, okay, what kind of T-shirts do people want to buy this spring? That's where it starts. Okay? It starts with some assessment of consumer demand. So if I am Gap, okay, I am going to think about, you know, I think people are going to want, you know, the green T-shirts in size medium with the sequins this spring, okay? And they will then work with a cut and sew firm, okay, to design that T-shirt, right? Okay. Now, as a consumer, what I want is three things. Okay? I want my T-shirt to be cheap. I want it to be good quality. I also want it fast. Now, what I mean by that third thing is that when I go into the store, I want the T-shirt that I want to be sitting on the shelf, right? I'm not going to come back next week for it, okay? It either has to be there and I'll buy it, and if it's not, I'm going to go take my business somewhere else. So consumer demand has those three elements in apparel. I want it fast, I want it high quality, and I want it cheap, right? So that's the apparel consumer. So that means that this retailer is saying to this firm, what? I want it fast, cheap, and high quality, right? So the demand is being funneled for those essential attributes, right? The Gap is saying to its supplier factory, okay, I need it cheap, I need it right away, okay, and I need it to be high quality. Okay. Now, doesn't that mean that the factory that's sewing the T-shirt is in turn turning around to the fabric producer and saying, I need it cheap, I need it right away, and I need it high quality? Okay. And isn't the fabric producer turning around and saying that to the yarn spinner? And isn't the yarn spinner turning around and saying that to the cotton farmer, right? So that consumer demand for these attributes ripples, doesn't it? All the way through this supply chain. And you get to the bottom and you can go and talk to the cotton farmers and they will tell you, okay, well the textile mill wants this or wants that or wants the other thing in terms of the properties of the cotton, right? So it's really important to recognize that we start at the top with the consumer because everything else derives from those consumer demands. Now, there's no particular reason that the countries and the companies who are good at this piece in terms of producing cheap, fast, high quality will be the same firms and countries who are good at this piece, fast, cheap, high quality, right? Because growing cotton, is a completely different set of capabilities than is sewing a T-shirt. And sewing a T-shirt is a completely different set of capabilities than marketing it to the consumer and so forth. And so what has happened in apparel in the past 30 years or so, has been this huge kind of spreading out of the supply chain where each of these pieces tends to take place in different countries because different countries have capabilities at different stages in terms of fast, cheap, and quality. The United States is the undisputed leader in fast, cheap, high-quality cotton. Right now, China is the undisputed leader in fast, cheap, high-quality sewing. In the middle, you have all kinds of other countries. Indonesia is a very productive yarn spinner and so forth. So the question, why the map looks the way it does, what's going on is that every stage, when the person above it says, okay, where can I get it fast, cheap, and high quality, they look everywhere in the world, and they make a choice. And then the next person looks everywhere in the world and makes another choice about that, and so forth and so on. And as long as everybody's looking all the way around the world for the fastest and the cheapest and the highest quality, you are going to get this supply chain that is spread out everywhere. So this rippling of consumer demand is really what's driving this whole thing. Now, if you think about it that way, what's not to like? I mean, this is just market competition at work, where whoever does one thing best sort of wins. And you get a sense of the very different capabilities. So, for example, what do you think you need to do this part well? What do you need? Lots of what?
Labor.
Lots of labor, and you need the labor to be cheap, right? That's what you need here. Okay. High quantity of labor, low price of labor. I don't need any labor at all here. Cotton is now essentially produced by machines. Okay? So the idea is I'm going to look at these countries, see their different resources and capabilities, and then kind of the piece of this that takes place at that country, at that location, starts to make sense. Now back to the question, what's not to like about this? Why would anybody, say this was somehow bad? And this is where I get to one of the primary lessons, I think, that I took away from writing this book. And that's that while in theory, you might say, okay, everybody's competing to be the fastest and cheapest and so forth, and so let's just let the best person win. Okay? Actually, that's not quite how it works, because often at each stage, the playing field is tilted in one way or another in a way that makes some participants think that, hey, this just is not fair. This just is not fair. The example that I give sometimes is I've been to Beijing a lot, and in Beijing there's this street in downtown Beijing where they have a lot of street food stalls set up, and you can walk down the block and you see 100 different guys cooking these little dumplings, and the dumplings look exactly the same. And so this is kind of a very perfectly competitive market, and you think, okay, whoever is making the best dumplings here should win, and that's like fair, right? And the answer is yeah, and then you start to talk to them about how this actually works, And actually, it's not really the best dumplings who win. Well, who wins? Well, the guy who has the dumpling spot, and these are just like little stands that they set up. The guy who has the spot on this corner that gets the traffic from both directions, he's the one who's going to win, right? Okay, that's fine. Well, how did he get that corner spot? Well, he paid a bribe, okay? And his brother is the one who decides who gets the spots. And now all of a sudden say, wait a minute, that's not fair, right? It's no longer about the best, cheapest dumpling. It's about who has the power to cheat their way to get this corner spot, right? So all of a sudden we're saying that competition is not fair anymore. Okay? And what I'm saying is that there are examples of that kind of crooked corner dumpling thing going on at virtually every piece of this. Okay? Not all the time, not everywhere, but enough so that people become sometimes distrustful of the whole thing. So, for example, one of the things that is, was out there in the news a lot this year was the Farm Bill. Anybody remember hearing anything about the Farm Bill? Farm Bill was just passed again. It's passed like every 5 years. A big piece of the U.S. Farm Bill relates to subsidies for what are known as the big row crops. So the big row crops are cotton, soy, wheat, corn, like you drive across Iowa or wherever and just, all you see is corn. So those big row crops in American farm policy attract very big subsidies. These subsidies are not really justifiable anymore. They were put in place in the Great Depression for a certain reason. That reason is kind of obsolete. But, the political power of the big cotton and the big corn and the big wheat farmers is such that, these subsidies in various forms have stayed in place. Okay? When I was writing the book, about a third of cotton farmers' income in the United States from federal subsidies. Okay? Now, so who's going to, who cares about that besides the taxpayers? Well, what happens is if you pay cotton farmers these subsidies in the United States, there's going to be a lot more cotton grown, and as the supply of cotton in the market goes up, the price goes down, and that negatively impacts growers in poorer countries. Okay? And so in Brazil, for example, in Africa, these countries have gone to the World Trade Organization and said, hey, these subsidies, that's not fair. That's cheating, in effect. So that's not about, who's doing it the best and cheapest and fastest cotton. That's about, you guys kind of not playing fair. Okay, so that's an example of the corner dumpling stand problem. And in fact, the World Trade Organization has found that the U.S. is guilty, okay, of subsidies that are, essentially not fair in world agricultural trade. So that's like one example. Another example is that in our trade agreements, you've heard of things like NAFTA and CAFTA, and now the TPP, Trade Preference Program, or the Trade Promotion Program, for the Trans-Pacific. I'm getting my acronyms messed up. Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Promotion. So they're all T's and P's, which is essentially a big free trade area that they're negotiating now. Well, the yarn spinners, are, if you read the New York Times last week, had a couple of editorials that saying, why are you negotiating this thing in secret? And then little things leak out from the negotiations. And one of the things that leaks out is that various yarn spinning groups are saying, okay, yeah, we're going to have free trade in apparel. That's fine, but only if you use yarn from these countries. Okay? So if I get a rule like that written into the trade rules, again, I'm no longer winning because my yarn is the best and the cheapest. I'm winning because I've been able to influence the rules in my favor. Okay? So without going too far into this, I could keep giving you examples. What you're seeing is, kind of versions of this corner dumpling problem. Okay? And probably the main thing I learned in writing the book is, that this is something that really bothers people. It bothers people a lot, when they perceive that the rules that govern their business are not fair. Okay? And there is a fair amount of this in our global trade regime, a fair amount of it. Okay? Now, sometimes, this stuff is, it's perfectly legal, corporations lobbying and things like that. But sometimes, particularly in very poor countries, it's much nastier than that. The broad heading of the kind of things I'm talking about would be called poor governance. If the rules just aren't transparent, if they don't apply to everybody, if it's possible to cheat, if it's possible, there's a lot of corruption, or there's bribes, or what have you. If just, the rules aren't enforced, or they're not even made, if the system is kind of failing in that way, we say that we have poor governance. And governance in the United States is generally pretty strong. But in many of the countries that are involved with this T-shirt, governance is much, much weaker. So with this notion of poor governance in our heads, okay, the rules don't apply to everybody and the rules are made unfairly, so forth and so on. Let's take a look at a quick video clip. Yeah.
The death toll continues to rise following the collapse of a building in Bangladesh on Wednesday morning. At least 175, mainly women workers, are now known to have died, with a rescue operation to free many more who are trapped continuing well into Thursday. The 8-storey Rana Plaza building just outside the capital, Dhaka, was home to a number of factories supplying Western clothing retailers. More than 1,000 people were injured.
We didn't want to go up to the factory this morning, but the management forced us to go up and said there was no problem with the building. Just after I sat at my table to work, the building just collapsed. I couldn't even leave.
Inside at about 9:10 a.m. the building collapsed and we have been trapped inside since then, and up to now it is 10:18 p.m. 11 hours we were trapped. We did not want to enter the building, but the owners pushed us in to go to work.
Families gathered at a nearby school on Thursday where the bodies were being taken. Many wept as they held up photos, desperately seeking news of their relatives. The Rana Plaza building collapse follows a fire at another factory on the outskirts of Dhaka that killed 112 people in November, and another incident at a factory in January in which 7 people died, raising concerns about worker safety and low wages in Bangladesh.
So, remember what you said was the critical capability that we needed at that sowing phase, right? Lots of people, low wages. So lots of people, low wages is becoming less and less true in China. And so what has happened in the past few years is a tremendous flood of this stage to Bangladesh. So Bangladesh, and this is brand new, is now the world's second largest apparel exporter. And they produce for virtually every Western retailer. 80% of manufacturing workers in Bangladesh work in cut and sew factories. 80%. Garments are 80% of Bangladesh's exports. So you see really an unprecedented concentration or importance of this industry to this country. Now, do you all, like right now, trust that this building's not going to fall on us? Yeah. So in order to trust that the building's not going to fall on us, who else are you trusting? I mean, who do you know?
Builders.
You're trusting the builders, you're trusting the government, you're trusting the building code, you're trusting the university, you're trusting the education of the architects, right? Okay. All of this is under the heading of governance. So you are saying that you trust the governance, okay, of the society in which we live to be one in which the buildings don't fall on us, right? Because all of these pieces have to fit together, right? Okay. Now, where was the governance collapse in this building collapse? Well, if you dig into what happened here, the whole story of this factory, of this building, was a story of missing, absent governance. So the building itself was illegally constructed. Okay? There was never a building permit. Okay? There were the guy who owned the building. You know, you read the news accounts, they talk about him, they call him a thug or a criminal. He was very politically powerful, so he just threw up this building and everybody left him alone. He traveled with a gang of men that surrounded him with guns. Okay? They then, after they built this illegal building, okay, they went back and they just put extra stories on top of it. Okay? 3 more stories on top of this building. And once again, there was no governance. You know, all of this stuff that you and I trust to keep our building from falling down, none of it was there. None of it was there. Okay? No building inspections, no building codes, okay? No enforcement, no contracts, okay? So forth and so on. So you have a complete failure of governance in this country, in this industry right now. Now, let's go back to one thing that 2 of these workers said. And by the way, they filmed this like the day after, and they said 126 people have died. It was over 1,100 when it was all over with. Over 1,100. Let's go back to a couple of things that 2 different workers said. Okay? They said they made us go back in, right? They made us go back into that building. Let's think about that. So, suppose we're all sitting here and this building does start to shake. Okay? What are you guys going to do? And if, you know, your professor said go back in, you know, probably not, right? Probably not. So what does this say about the power imbalance that's at work here? Okay. So they're feeling the building shake, they're wanting to leave, they leave, and the boss says go back in, and they go back in. Okay. What could be going on here? You know, once again, we have something that we can't really understand, right? Because we know we wouldn't go back in there. Right? But they're going back in there because they're going to lose their jobs if they don't. Okay? Why would the factory owners push them back in, though? Why would they do that?
They have a deadline, production deadline.
It goes back to what part of what the consumer wants?
Fast.
The fast part, right? So if you talk to these factory owners, and I have, they'll say, you know, whoever it is, you know, Gap or Penny or Walmart or H&M or Target, you know, we have to have this shipment out tomorrow. Okay? We have to have this shipment out tomorrow. There's such time pressure, okay, on the delivery, and there's such time pressure on the delivery because it is the Western consumer that wants their stuff right now. Okay? So, and these companies feel, and they will tell you, you know, if I don't meet the deadline, then I'm going to lose the order. Okay? And so if you don't go back into the building, then I'm not going to meet the deadline, and then we're going to lose the order, and then you're not going to have a job. So there's the reason. Okay? A, that the building falls down, lack of governance, and B, that workers are going back in. Okay? One of the things that always makes me a little nervous, I was walking yesterday down Connecticut Avenue in Washington, and I saw a sign outside of a clothing store, and it said, new items every week. Okay? New items every week. Okay? So the only way to get new items every week, because you can't just have any items, right? You have to have the stuff that people want to buy. And the only way you get the stuff that people want to buy is to have very, very careful inventory control things so that you know what's being demanded right now. You're looking at your computer and saying, okay, we need 1,000 more of those green mini skirts in size 10 with the sequins. Okay? How do you get those on the shelves that fast? Okay, is you have to put that pressure from the top of that supply chain on down. Okay? And so one of the things that has happened in this industry, okay, is that we have two kind of forces at work at once. Okay? One, we have poor governance in Bangladesh, where the government is not up to the task of keeping the people safe, and that is colliding with the pressure from the consumers in the West who want new stuff every week. Right? Those two things are colliding. Okay? There are many, 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 probably most, I think, good factories in Bangladesh, particularly in the export processing zone. These factories have been constructed well. These factories are monitored well. They are safe places to work. Okay? Many, many, many good factories. And those factories are operating 24 hours a day to meet incredible growth in consumer demand. But they can't handle it if all of a sudden retailer XYZ says, I need 1,000 of those pink sequins miniskirts next week. Okay? The good factories can't handle those kinds of surges often. And so what happens is that those orders will be pushed out to suppliers, in sort of a set of concentric circles. I can't make them. Well, can your brother's factory make them? Well, no, but my brother's nephew's factory can maybe make them, and so forth and so on. And so you have these illegally constructed factories with the layers of extra stories on top, and those rush orders often get pushed out into those production facilities. So there is a role, right? The Western consumer does play a role in all of this, particularly related to the phenomenon of what we sometimes call fast fashion. The brands and the retailers who always want to have new things on the shelves. Okay. Now, I still very much believe that open trade among countries, particularly in apparel, is the best path. But I also believe that a particularly dangerous combination is the combination of poor governance in the producing countries with unpredictable fast fashion type demand by consumers in the rich countries. It's that combination that I think often can be quite flammable. So what's going to happen next in Bangladesh? Well, that kind of comes to the question of how does governance improve in a country such as that? What are the forces that either take it the wrong way or the right way? Traditionally, the forces for improved governance, particularly in a democracy, come from the citizens themselves, right? Okay. And we saw some of this in Bangladesh. We see protests in Bangladesh about, political participation, about corruption and so forth. But actually, I think that trade, international trade, does have also a positive role to play here. Okay? All of these brand names that we all know, none of those want to be associated with this kind of thing, right? None of them. They all see that as a big risk to the value of their companies, the value of their equity, so forth and so on. And so they are actually now being pressured, but also volunteering to try to be a part of the governance solution. Some companies, Disney is one, who just said, I'm out of here. They pulled out entirely. Okay, I'm not going to produce any Mickey Mouse t-shirts in Bangladesh. Okay. So they cannot worry about this anymore, but that has a negative consequence for those workers, right? the workers are not, if all the companies said we're not going to produce in Bangladesh, then all these workers would be in trouble. So we do have pressure, I think, that's starting to be put on the governance by the global trade system itself. Okay? We have agreements that are being signed where the retailers are taking some responsibility for the building codes, for example, where the retailers are sending in their own building inspectors, so forth and so on. So I think that trade and the citizens themselves can be a positive force for positive change on the governance side. I have one other T-shirt to show you. So you've heard all about this one. This is another one that's totally, totally different. Okay. This T-shirt, if I were to put the map up there, it would be like all within about 60 or 70 miles. It's a North Carolina local T-shirt. So the cotton was grown in North Carolina, the yarn was spun, the sewing, everything all took place in a little region of North Carolina. Okay? Entirely local. Okay? I think this T-shirt, is, if you're out T-shirt shopping, is a good choice. Certainly a good choice for somebody who wants to know everything about where their T-shirt came from, or who's very concerned about the environmental impact of all of the, freight and so forth, or maybe somebody who is very interested in supporting local businesses in North Carolina. This T-shirt costs a lot more, but it's a good choice for a certain segment of the population who wants this kind of product, right? But what I don't want to do, is go so far as to say that this is a better T-shirt, that we should all be buying this one instead of this one. Okay? Because I still do think that the global story of my T-shirt is, on balance, on net, a positive story for the world, and is actually creating certain kinds of opportunities in places that need it even more than North Carolina does. Okay. Another way to think about this is this T-shirt is made by people who are kind of like us, right? And who look like us, right? Who look like us. I'm going to close by showing you pictures of the people who made my T-shirt, this one. And what I love about this, and these are all people that I write about in the book, what I love about this is how much, this global supply chain, the cotton farmers, T1G, the seamstress in China, Jeffrey Milonge sells used T-shirts in Tanzania. These are trade negotiators in Brussels. How much the supply chain of my T-shirt kind of looks like the world. And I think that one of the things that I took away finally from this project is that, having people from different parts of the world involved in this supply chain, bringing their different perspectives, their different skin colors, their different religious beliefs, their different political beliefs, causing these people to all be in a bucket and have to talk to one another, is fundamentally a force for even peace in the world as we move forward. So, thank you very much. Yep.
Right on. And we have time for questions and comments.
Just out of
What's your
curiosity,
name?
Ellen.
Ellen?
Out of curiosity, how much was the local T-shirt that you bought, like price difference wise?
This one was $6, and this one's about $25.
And it's 2 or 3 times heavier?
Yeah, this one is a much better T-shirt. So this one feels a lot better than this one, right? Yeah. So they're not, it's much thicker. You can do that, yeah. Other questions, comments?
Danielle, I was wondering how long did it take for the T-shirt, starting with the cotton, all the way into the retailer? How long was that time?
So that would be, so cotton only gets picked, at a certain time of year. But I think you could do that whole chain, let's see. You could do cotton to yarn in a couple of weeks. You can do yarn to fabric immediately, and then you can do fabric to sewing also pretty immediately. So I would say you could do the whole thing in a week, and then you'd have to add in the transportation time. So one of the big disadvantages of being Bangladesh is how long it takes to get to the market here. And so they have to reduce their price a lot to compensate for that longer freight time.
Okay. So the week to week is definitely doable.
Yeah, it is. I mean, especially in in the U.S. Most of our T-shirts now come from Honduras. So, you can get your fabric or your yarn to Honduras, in a morning.
My name's Madeline.
Madeline.
Does your book at all talk about kind of like the wastefulness of our society, as far as like the fact that 90% of our goodwill like kind of goes to these other countries? Like if we could just manage our supply chains maybe a little better and like have it more closely linked to the demand of consumers, we wouldn't have as much like excess supply and things like that.
I think the reason that we throw so much away is because we like to shop, right? So it's kind of like in accounting, right? Like kind of like FIFO. You can't keep buying stuff without getting rid of stuff, right? So I think fundamentally it's about the fact that, the prices of new clothing has been falling for about 20 years as production has moved to Asia, and that just makes us buy more and more of it. Now, is that wasteful? I think there's a way, you could think about that and say, yeah, that's wasteful, but that's essentially, it's about people wanting to go shopping. I mean, that's what's behind it all, right? And, the other way to think about waste is this clothing is being used. And in fact, the recycled textile industry makes a big point of saying, something like that a lot more fabric and textiles could be diverted from the waste stream, and that the worst case is to just have it be, in a landfill. So,
My name is Scott. I like how you talked about the importance of the American consumer, or the Western consumer, kind of driving this the good, fast, and cheap mantra. I guess my question is, let's say that I was worried about your graphic and I did want to do kind of a North Carolina solution. How would a mainline retailer ever pick up on that? Because when I walk into the store and I don't buy their T-shirts, they don't know why I didn't buy it.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's a good question, but first of all, we do have data that is now coming to light on what we call reshoring, which is the movement of certain kinds of production back to the United States. And we do also know that there's a couple big brands out there that are successfully trading on the Made in America theme. So, for example, American Apparel, you've heard of that? That's the big one. It's all made in the United States. It hasn't gotten to the point yet where the big department stores are branding Made in America, but I think by the next year or two you're going to see that. Walmart just made a big statement about it. So to the extent that these companies do have their ways of figuring out what we want, right? And they're pretty good at it. So to the extent that Made in America is going to carry some brand value, and I think they're going to jump on it too. Part of the reason is that they are concerned about these kinds of risks in their supply chain, and part of the reason is that there seems to be, it's very fickle. Consumers are very, very fickle. So if you ask a bunch of them right now, hey, will you pay more for a T-shirt made in America? They'll all say yes. And you ask them next week, they'll say no. But I think that if there is a demonstrated preference, then they will respond to it.
But isn't that the kind of problem, though, is they kind of have to guess what the preference is going to be? They can't really...
But they can observe where they can follow the money, right? They can follow the dollars. So once Walmart, and I think this is going to happen in the next couple of weeks, starts to put, they're made in America signs up on these T-shirts over here, they can count, who's buying those and who's buying the other ones.
And those will be more expensive?
Those will be more expensive.
Double?
I don't think they'll be double. I don't think they'll be double.
And then quality?
I don't know. Yeah, good question. I don't know.
In your book, you talk, you cite Tom Friedman's book, The Lotus and the Olive Tree. You talk about, Lexus and the Olive Tree, I'm sorry, and it talks about gazelles and is it lions? Could you just tell a little bit about that, because you make a pretty big point about that.
So he's got a book about globalization. It's it came out quite a while ago. It's called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. The reason that's the name of the book is the Lexus refers to the car, fancy car, olive tree. And he's talking about two different parts of the global economy. One very undeveloped, people are working in the olive plantations. One very high-tech and developed for producing these fancy cars. And he writes about how different parts of the globe are kind of engaged in the global economy through those different ways, right? And he talks about global competition using a metaphor. He says there's a lion and there's a gazelle. Right? And so the gazelle has to run faster than the lion, right? Or the gazelle dies. But the lion has to run faster than the gazelle or the lion dies, right? Because he has nothing to eat. Right? And so he talks about this kind of competition, and the reason that I write about it is because I think in some ways the competition that I observed in the supply chain has pieces of lion, but it also has pieces of gazelle. And what I mean by that is that, gazelle-style competition to me is sort of winning fair and square, because you're just the fastest. Whereas lion-style competition to me was, well, wait a minute, you're winning kind of by being mean. You're eating somebody. That's like not fair. And so the idea is, there's all kinds of ways to win. Right? You can win really by being the fastest and the best, but you can also win through means that maybe aren't as upmarket, right? And, again, much of the reticence that I hear when I talk to people about trade and globalization, has to do with lion-style competition, where somehow somebody's making a judgment that, wait a minute, that's just not fair.
Nobody's talking about fairness with gazelles.
Right. Everybody thinks it's fair if the gazelle can just run really fast. That seems to be okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So is your argument in your book centered more towards anti-globalization or pro-globalization?
So, fundamentally at the end of the line, I am a free trader. So I believe that open trade flows between countries lead to a better world than do, and this is not even, this isn't even in dispute, because if you look at the countries that have closed their borders to trade, these are the most miserable places on the planet. You have Cuba, you have North Korea, you have, Burma. So there's no doubt that trade is overall a force for good. I certainly believe that. But at the same time, I don't think that's quite enough to say to the skeptics. Okay? I think that if, as we look around and see how things work in practice, we're obligated to say, wait a minute, this piece over here, that's a corner dumpling thing, and that's not quite fair. Let's fix that piece. And let's fix this piece over here, and so forth and so on. I think there's a lot of pieces of this machine that aren't operating as well as they could.
We have about 4 minutes.
Okay.
Just going off of that, was there any point in your research that you were discouraged by everything that you were finding and you weren't sure that you were going to come up with this conclusion that globalization is good for the world?
Well, I started out with that bias. So I started out thinking it was good. So really where, my learning over all those years took place was kind of moving me from being a really staunch on that point to being able to see the other side a little bit. So that was my own evolution. Somebody else had a hand up.
should the U.S. and EU loosen up their subsidies?
No, I think so. I think Doha is dead. Doha is the global trade negotiations. It's supposed to involve kind of everybody, and it's been dead for, I don't know, 12 years, something like that. So what's happened, is essentially that, okay, so all of us in this room can't agree on a deal, so your table will make a deal, and then your table will make their own deal, and then maybe you two tables will make a deal together. I mean, that's how it's going to happen. And that's what's going on now with TPP, is, all these little subgroups are making deals because the overall thing is so, stuck. And the more the little subgroups make deals, the less pressure there is for the big thing to happen. So, it's. I don't think so. Maybe eventually, but I think most of the work, most of the progress on this stuff is going to be happening in smaller groups. Yeah.
One last question.
Has your research and, I guess, greater knowledge of what goes on in the apparel industry affected your behavior as a consumer?
It does. I always look at the tag. I always look at the tag. I'm sort of past my big clothes buying days, but it does affect what my kids do. And so I noticed that both my students and then my own children, you can now do research. You can figure out which companies are a bit more socially responsible than others, which companies are trying to put the right kinds of codes in place, which countries are trying to address the problems in Bangladesh. And I think that if I were a big apparel consumer now, I would be paying attention to those things. Absolutely. Now there's a lot of information out there. For somebody who wants to be an informed consumer, you can be.
Well, let's thank Pietra for